She married a man 35 years younger, gave him her name, her jewels, her pride, and in return, he vanished. Days later, Princess Viktoria of Prussia, daughter of an emperor and granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was found dead in a rented flat. No guards, no funeral, just poison in her veins, and a wedding dress folded beneath her head. Born in a palace where chandeliers sparkled above marble floors and bloodlines mattered more than breath itself, Victoria Elizabeth Auguste Charlotte of Prussia came into the world not as a child, but as a symbol, an heirloom of power wrapped in lace, the living bridge between two empires, the German and the British. She opened her eyes for the first time on April 12, 1866, within the golden confines of the Neues Palais in Potsdam, as drums rolled in salute and cannons fired into the spring air, announcing not merely a birth, but a continuation of something far older than her own heartbeat, dynasty, protocol, the weight of centuries curling softly around her infant fingers like invisible chains. Her father, Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, future Frederick III, was a man of learning and liberal dreams. And her mother, Victoria, Princess Royal, was the eldest daughter of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, a woman raised in the storm and strictness of British royalty, carrying within her both a keen intelligence and the bitter burden of being always slightly foreign in the German court she had married into. Victoria, nicknamed Moretta by her family to distinguish her from the many Victorias that surrounded her life, grew up surrounded not just by toys and tutors, but by expectations that pressed down like velvet lead. Because she was beautiful. Not just pleasant, not merely comely, but luminously, arrestingly, indisputably beautiful in the way that made painters ask to sketch her, and newspapers whisper about the loveliest Hohenzollern. From an early age, she moved like a melody through the corridors of imperial homes. Sanssouci, Friedrichshof, Berlin's vast palaces, her laughter bouncing against gilt walls, her dresses rustling like pages of a story yet unwritten, her future presumed to be golden because her blood was gilded and her gaze, when it met a room, made people pause mid-sentence. She had the kind of charm that couldn't be taught and the kind of spirit that refused to sit silently beside protocol. She was witty without being cruel, confident without being cold. And when she entered society, many thought she would marry someone destined to wear a crown, not merely a prince, but perhaps a future monarch, maybe even a king. Indeed, there had been whispers, loud, tantalizing whispers, of a union between Victoria and her cousin, Prince Louis of Battenberg, a match of affection and alignment. But politics swept it aside like a hand brushing crumbs from a table. Later, there were talks of others, but nothing ever quite aligned the way court gossip hoped it would. Still, in those years, Victoria shone. She hosted salons with artists and military men, walked proudly beside her mother during state ceremonies, and played her part in the grand machine of empire with grace, curiosity, and a touch of theatrical flair that made her one of the most beloved figures of her generation. An emblem of refinement, femininity, and European nobility at its zenith. But even emblems crack, and even stars fall. Because behind the glittering carriages and diamond-studded brooches, Victoria was growing up in a family under siege. Not from invaders or revolutions, but from time, illness, and the slow erosion of dreams that had once felt immortal. Her mother, so commanding in public, was often exhausted in private, clinging to English customs that alienated her in Berlin. And her father, for all his idealism, was increasingly sidelined by the iron will of his father, Emperor Wilhelm I, and the shadow of Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who cared little for sentiment. Victoria watched, quietly, as her parents' vision for a liberal, enlightened German monarchy was mocked by the growing militarism of the empire. And though she still smiled for portraits and curtsied at balls, the world beneath her satin slippers was already beginning to shift. The fairy tale was cracking, but no one was supposed to notice. She grew into adulthood during a time when Europe still believed in the illusion of unshakable monarchies, when the dresses got heavier and the rules tighter, when love was never about affection and always about alliance, and when a princess's worth was measured not in the content of her thoughts, but in the strategic value of her womb. And yet, Victoria retained something rare, a softness that hadn't hardened into bitterness, a willingness to laugh, to hope, to believe in the possibility of something personal amidst the machinery of political marriage and public image. She wrote long letters, painted delicate watercolors, and confided in her siblings, especially her sisters Charlotte and brother Henry, revealing dreams that were never printed in newspapers. Dreams of marriage, yes, but one with kindness, with warmth, with a home that felt like shelter instead of display. But dreams, especially royal ones, often die quietly in candlelight. As she passed her 20s unmarried, unusual but not scandalous, those around her began to wonder, was she too choosy, too romantic, too spoiled by the illusion that she could have both love and station? What they did not see was the quiet grief beneath her poise, the way she watched her friends marry, move away, raise children while she stayed behind. Her days increasingly filled with polite duties and polite loneliness. The woman who had once been the belle of the imperial court was, by 30, considered a relic of wasted potential. No longer the shining daughter of two empires, she was becoming, in the eyes of the world, a secondary figure. A shadow trailing behind her siblings, behind history, behind the thunder of a world that was moving toward war, revolution, and the death of old orders. But Victoria was still alive. And that, perhaps, is where the tragedy begins. Not in the fall itself, but in how long it took, and how deeply it hurt, and how quietly it all happened, as if history was too embarrassed to admit what it had done to her. She had been born to shine. But the light, it seemed, had other plans. It was in the spring of her 22nd year, when the lilacs were blooming again in Potsdam, and the air still carried the scent of court musicians practicing for the summer balls, that Victoria watched everything she believed to be solid begin to dissolve, beginning not with a war nor a scandal, but with the slow, cruel unraveling of her father's throat. Frederick III, once the proud and promising heir to the German Empire, had waited decades behind his aging father, Wilhelm I, nurturing liberal ideals and dreams of a kinder, more constitutional monarchy. A vision forged through travels to Britain, through conversation with philosophers, and through the quiet influence of his English wife, Victoria. But when the throne at last came to him in March 1888, it came bearing not power, but cancer, and not glory, but a ticking death sentence that robbed him of voice, then strength, then life, in a matter of weeks. For 99 days, just over 3 months, he reigned not with speeches or laws, but through nods, scribbled notes, and the agonizing silence of a man who had waited too long for a chance that now mocked him with its lateness. Victoria, barely more than a girl, sat beside her mother during those days, watching the weight of the crown consume her father from the inside out, his breath growing more shallow, his gaze more distant, until the moment came when even the emperor's body surrendered to the inevitability that history had written not a reign, but a footnote. And then, like a door slamming shut in a hallway and already darkened, her world changed entirely. The throne passed not into the hands of someone tender or aligned with her father's values, but to her older brother Wilhelm, now Wilhelm II, whose militaristic vision and hunger for personal glory would steer Germany towards storms far bloodier than any of them yet imagined, and who, despite being her own flesh and blood, regarded his mother's side of the family, the British side, with suspicion, scorn, and a growing appetite to rewrite what it meant to be Hohenzollern. Suddenly, Victoria was no longer the beloved daughter of a rising crown prince or the glittering link between two great empires. She was the sister of a Kaiser who saw his father's memory as an inconvenient echo and his mother's presence as a political liability. A Kaiser who began to systematically distance himself from anything that smelled of England, sentimentality, or softness. And in that sweeping realignment of court favor and personal power, Victoria, alongside her mother and siblings, found herself exiled, not in law, but in essence. Moved out of sight, out of favor, out of the inner circle of the imperial world she had once glided through like sunlight on polished floors. They were not imprisoned, not disgraced, not stripped of their titles or lands, but they were quietly erased from the center, relocated to summer homes and distant villas, their appearances at state functions reduced, their opinions unwelcome. Their very presence a reminder of a past the new emperor sought to bury beneath iron and drums. Her mother, the once proud Princess Royal of England, became a widow not just in grief, but in relevance, writing long, aching letters to her mother Queen Victoria, trying to keep her children connected to the British crown, trying to preserve what little she could of the liberal legacy her husband had hoped to pass down. And Victoria, once her father's favorite and her mother's pride, watched herself become something spectral, something ornamental. A princess whose beauty still turned heads, but whose future seemed to shrink with every passing year. She attended operas, yes, and garden parties, and court gatherings where her name was still spoken with a certain reverence. But it was reverence wrapped in melancholy, in speculation, in the invisible question that hovered like perfume in the air around her. Why had she not married yet? Was she too proud? Too difficult? Too romantic? Too English? None dared say aloud what many whispered in corners, that Victoria's time was passing, that the light around her was dimming, that perhaps the throne she was born beneath had already decided she would never sit beside one of her own. In private, she smiled. She still painted. She still danced. She still dreamed. But those dreams began to shift, from visions of a crown and consort to smaller, sadder desires, of companionship, of kindness, of not being left behind in a world that was reshaping itself without her. The years crept forward like water under a door, quiet, relentless, and cold. She lived with her mother in Friedrichshof, a grand but melancholy villa built as a monument to her late father, where portraits of Frederick III still hung in every room, and the furniture whispered of a grandeur that no longer ruled Berlin. She visited her siblings, especially Charlotte and Henry, who themselves were struggling with personal disappointments, strained marriages, and a sense that the imperial age they had inherited was beginning to rust beneath their feet. And she watched, helplessly, as Wilhelm II tightened his grip on power, growing more theatrical, more arrogant, more determined to recast the German monarchy in his own image, which left little room for sisters with their father's gentle voice or their mother's English sorrow. What Victoria could not have known, what none of them could have foreseen, was that all of this, all the slow suffocations, all the rearrangements of loyalty and power, all the fading relevance and fading hope, was merely the prelude to a cataclysm that would tear down not just palaces and crowns, but the very meaning of monarchy in Europe. But long before the bombs fell and the emperors fled, Victoria had already begun her quiet descent. Not a fall, not yet, but a drifting away from the center of history, step by step, breath by breath, year by year, until the princess born to shine stood at the edge of something far more cruel than obscurity, the slow death of purpose, of role, of being seen. And in that space, cold, dignified, echoing with memory, she waited. For what, she could not say. But it would not be a crown. It would not be love. And it would not be mercy. When the First World War erupted in the summer of 1914, shattering the delicate glass of old alliances, courtly protocols, and the illusion that monarchs could still dictate the course of modernity with the flick of a glove. It did not begin with blood in Victoria's parlor, but with the quiet disappearance of letters, the sudden tightening of invitations, the slow realization that even being royal could not protect one from irrelevance, especially when the world no longer wanted royalty at all. At first, she tried to remain composed, loyal, suspended in the familiar rituals of rank, tea in porcelain cups, correspondence written in English and German, polite dinners with widowed aunts and military cousins. But as the years dragged on and the war grew louder, trains filled with soldiers replacing carriages filled with courtiers, gas masks replacing opera masks, Victoria found herself caught in a slow suffocation, not from fire or fear, but from the haunting silence of being slowly erased. By the time the war ended in 1918, with Germany defeated, humiliated, bleeding from its borders, and bled dry within, the empire her ancestors had forged and her brother had ruled with hubris and deaf pride was no more. The Kaiser, once her own sibling and sovereign, fled to Holland in disgrace, leaving behind a broken capital, a bitter republic, and a family name that now drew contempt instead of reverence. The monarchy was dissolved, not with fanfare or a bullet, but with ink and signatures and the final, irretrievable collapse of 1,000 years of belief in divine right. And for Victoria, the change was not merely political. It was physical, spiritual, existential. There was no longer a crown above her, nor a nation beneath her feet that called her its princess. She had not just lost her position. She had lost the entire stage on which her role had been written. The palaces were closed or confiscated, the titles no longer recognized, the servants dismissed, the guards vanished like mist in the morning. And suddenly, at 52, Victoria stood in the wreckage of her lineage with no shield but memory, no weapon but dignity, and no audience to witness the quiet undoing of everything that had once told her who she was. She moved from estate to estate, from borrowed villas to forgotten guest houses, always dressed impeccably, always polite, always carrying herself with the erect grace of someone taught that posture could be power, even when power was a memory. But behind the smiles, behind the carefully chosen gloves and veils, lay a growing sense of detachment, not just from others, but from herself, as if each passing year peeled away another layer of meaning from the title she once wore like armor. She was still called princess, yes, in certain social circles, in brittle newspapers, in whispers of nostalgia among monarchist loyalists who gathered in drawing rooms to sip port and mourn their invisible empires. But the truth was starker, colder, more intimate. She was aging. She was unmarried. She was penniless in a world that now taxed the remnants of nobility and mocked their claims to importance. And she was alone. Her mother, the ever-formidable Victoria, had died in 1901, leaving behind a daughter who had never managed to escape her orbit and who now wandered through the ruins of European aristocracy like a faded portrait. Elegant, framed, but no longer hung. Most of her siblings had withdrawn into their own silent suffering, each facing the loss of status, the confusion of exile, the erosion of names that once commanded battalions. And though they occasionally wrote to one another, there was little they could do to fill the void left by a vanished world. The jewels, once counted by the dozen, had been quietly sold over the years to cover travel, heating, the modest dignity of hotel rooms in Switzerland, apartments in Bavaria, small favors from old friends whose wealth had survived the war better than bloodlines. Even the clothes had changed, not because Victoria desired change, but because the fashion of royalty was no longer about display, but survival. The gowns grew simpler, the hats smaller, the furs thinner, and the mirrors, oh, the mirrors. Once her closest allies in youth now became cruel judges, reflecting the creeping lines, the graying hair, the eyes that still held light but no longer drew admiration. She lived among photographs, old newspapers, and pressed flowers from gardens that no longer bore her name. She spoke less. She visited fewer people, and when she did, she smiled too often and for too long, as if compensating for a silence that no one dared to break. The silence of a princess whose story had ended before her life did. The young woman, who had once been courted by heirs and praised by painters, now wandered Bonn in quiet dignity, her name known only to clerks handling her modest bills, or to elderly aristocrats who remembered her from the age of carriage rides and waltzes. She had no estate of her own. She rented rooms. She kept her few belongings in trunks lined with lavender paper. And she wrote, still, every now and then, letters that had less and less to say, but were written in the same careful hand her governess had once praised. The newspapers rarely mentioned her anymore. When they did, it was in passing, in pieces about the fall of the Hohenzollerns, in nostalgic spreads comparing royal weddings of the past to the hurried civil ceremonies of the Republic, in cruel jokes about how the mighty had fallen. No one asked what it felt like to go from being addressed as Your Imperial Highness to being treated as an aging woman renting 2 rooms near the Rhine. No one asked what it did to the heart to be forgotten so thoroughly that even scandal would have been preferable to absence. And Victoria never volunteered the answer. She remained who she had always been, gracious, poised, private. But within her, within the silence, within the careful folding of napkins and the rereading of old letters, something had begun to hollow. Not bitterness, not rage, just absence. Just the kind of sorrow that no longer weeps, because even sorrow needs an audience. And Victoria had none. It was in the autumn of 1927, when the world around her had long since stopped whispering her name, with awe or expectation, and when even the leaves falling from the trees in Bonn seemed to do so with a kind of exhausted elegance, that Victoria, at 61 years old, unmarried, dethroned, quietly surviving on the shrinking edge of memory, met a man who would rewrite not her legacy, but the final stanza of a life that had once been written in gold ink. He was not a duke, not a noble, not a soldier or scholar. He came not with titles, nor property, nor a family name to dignify her own. He was a Russian émigré with little more than charm, ambition, and a beautiful face. 26 years old, half her age and more. A ghost of another revolution, wandering the brittle bones of post-war Europe in search of opportunity, affection, or perhaps only an audience. His name was Alexander Zubkov, a law student, a waiter, an amateur dancer in cheap ballrooms that still clung to chandeliers and faded glamour. He was the kind of man who smiled at older women as though they were still young. not because he loved them, necessarily, but because he understood that to be seen, even briefly, was sometimes enough to be loved in return. And Victoria, lonely, forgotten, elegant still in her carefully mended dresses and pearl earrings from another century, looked at him and saw something more than lust, more than youth. She saw someone who looked at her not as a relic, not as a burden, not as a joke, but as a woman still alive, still breathing, still able to be touched, not out of pity, but out of longing. She met him at a dinner party, half formal, half desperate. One of those strange gatherings where displaced nobles and exiles mingled with faded heiresses and bankrupt counts, all pretending the empire had not ended, all sipping from chipped glasses and remembering the taste of crystal. And he walked toward her with a casual confidence that ignored protocol entirely, sat down beside her without invitation, and said something. No one recorded what it was, that made her laugh in a way she hadn't in years. That laugh, perhaps, was the beginning. They met again, once by accident, then deliberately, walking by the Rhine, sharing tea, exchanging stories that were more about tone than content. And he called her Madame, not with sarcasm, but with reverence. And she, for the first time in decades, let herself be spoken to like a woman, not a dowager. He was tall, handsome, with dark hair and eyes that darted between caution and calculation. He danced well, spoke with a faint Slavic accent that made everything he said sound like a poem. And when he touched her hand, lightly, in public, Victoria did not pull away. The world, of course, noticed. The whispers returned, louder this time, crueler, laced with disbelief, envy, and an almost sadistic delight. A daughter of emperors, reduced to courting a penniless foreigner, a princess in her 60s, blushing at the touch of a man young enough to be her grandson. But Victoria, perhaps for the first time in her life, did not care. She had obeyed for 6 decades. Obeyed her family, her empire, the expectations of a world that had taken her youth and returned nothing but a polite exile. And now, in this strange man with no crown, no fortune, and no shame, she saw a final rebellion, a last tenderness, a way to end her life not in silence, but in color. When asked, by friends, by enemies, by journalists, why she would associate herself with such a man, she is said to have replied, "I have lived long enough for the dynasty. Now I shall live a little for myself." And so, in that year of 1927, beneath gray skies and rising debts, Victoria did what no one expected, what many condemned, and what some quietly envied. She married him. She wore white, not as an ironic gesture, but as a statement, as defiance, as a whisper to the world that she still believed in beginnings. He wore a military uniform, borrowed, ill-fitting, the insignia stitched hastily, a parody of past glories. But in the wedding photograph, their hands touch, and her smile, faint and fleeting, seems real. The press erupted. From Paris to Berlin, from London to Vienna, the newspapers carried headlines not of romance, but of scandal, humiliation, disbelief. Old princess marries young Russian. A love story or a final folly? From empire to eccentricity. Satirical sketches showed Victoria as a wrinkled bride clutching a gigolo. Caricatures of Zubkov portrayed him as a seducer, a con man, a thief of titles. Her family was appalled. Wilhelm II, in exile in the Netherlands, refused to acknowledge the union, calling it a betrayal of Hohenzollern blood. Cousins, nieces, and nephews severed ties. No invitations arrived from old friends, no gifts from former courts, just silence and gossip. But Victoria somehow smiled through it. perhaps because she no longer expected approval, perhaps because she believed in the lie of love, or perhaps, most heartbreakingly, because it was not a lie at all, at least to her. For in Alexander, she did not see only a man. She saw youth. She saw warmth. She saw a life that had nothing to do with thrones or treaties. A life that spoke in laughter, in dance, in the long, quiet evenings when his voice filled the rooms once haunted by memories of better men who never stayed. It was not a royal love. It was not even a respectable love. But it was hers. And for a woman who had given her entire life to duty, to silence, to standing still while the world changed around her, that was enough. Or so she thought. Because what she had not yet seen, what still hid behind his smile and the glint in his eye, was that while she had chosen love, he had chosen opportunity. And love, when unreciprocated, becomes a knife that never stops turning. The wedding was not held in a palace, nor in the chapel of a grand cathedral, nor in any hall graced by noble guests or ancestral spirits, but in a modest civil office in Bonn, surrounded by murmurs instead of music, smirks instead of ceremony, and the kind of silence that did not bless a union, but judged it before the ink had dried on the paper. And yet, Victoria stood tall, wrapped in ivory silk that no longer shimmered with imperial light, but still draped her with a ghost of dignity. Her hair pinned with trembling pearls, her smile composed like the last line of a poem written too late. Alexander Zubkov, ever the showman, arrived in a borrowed military uniform, a tattered, ill-fitting costume of old Russian pride, heavy on embroidery, but light on truth, posing as nobility in exile, a performance he had rehearsed so well that some among the onlookers believed, or pretended to believe, that he might be something more than a pauper with a taste for pageantry. He kissed her hand theatrically, bowed before the magistrate, and slipped the ring on her finger with the flourish of a man who understood performance, who understood that history might not care about sincerity, but it would remember spectacle. And in that moment, as cameras flashed and whispers fluttered like dying moths around them, Victoria believed, perhaps desperately, perhaps naively, that what she had done was not folly, but freedom. No one clapped. No relatives attended. The register was signed with an unfamiliar pen, the ink slightly smeared, as if reluctant to seal what so many called a farce. And yet Victoria, still holding the hand of the man she now called husband, walked out of that room with a calm steadiness that defied the age in her bones and the noise behind her back, stepping into a life that she hoped, no, that she needed, to be different from the one she had endured under crowns and shadows. But the world, especially the world of courts and cousins, did not forgive her. Her marriage was not merely mocked, it was weaponized. Newspapers across Europe ran headlines not of celebration, but of ridicule. Princess Mary's Russian waiter, granddaughter of Queen Victoria weds scoundrel. From Kaiser's sister to common fool. Editorials dissected her motives with surgical cruelty, some calling it a last gasp for relevance, others labeling it a perversion of royal blood, a betrayal of the Hohenzollern dignity, a grotesque spectacle of female delusion in old age. Caricaturists drew her with sagging cheeks and fluttering eyelashes, trailing after a young man with pockets full of her jewelry. No one mentioned her laughter. No one described the quiet way she reached for his hand at dinner. No one saw the humanity beneath the headlines, the ache of a woman who had lived too long in silence and simply wanted to be seen again, even if only in the eyes of someone whose love may have been thinner than the paper their vows were written on. Her family, humiliated and enraged, severed all remaining ties. Wilhelm II, nursing his bitterness in Dutch exile, declared her lost to decency and sent no word, no letter, not even a curse. The royal court, what was left of it in the debris of the fallen empire, closed its doors to her, not officially, but completely. Friends who had once dined with her now crossed the street. Invitations vanished. Silence spread around her like mold. But Victoria did not yield, not yet. She moved into a small apartment with her husband, still dressing carefully, still hosting small gatherings with embroidered napkins and hand-polished silver, still believing that respect could be rebuilt, if not from heritage, then from grace. At dances, she stood beside Zubkov as he spun younger women in circles, laughing louder than necessary, drinking more than appropriate, charming more than advisable. And when guests whispered that she was blind, or desperate, or both, she smiled politely, folded her hands in her lap, and said nothing. Because what could she say? That she had chosen him not because she was a fool, but because she was tired of feeling like furniture in a museum no one visited anymore. That when he looked at her, even if just for a moment, she felt something real crack through the polished shell of duty and loneliness. That love, even when foolish, is still a kind of rebellion. But rebellion, especially quiet rebellion, has a cost. And Victoria began to pay it in coin and in dignity. Zubkov spent freely. He took her to theaters, to clubs, to casinos. He borrowed against her name, used her jewelry as collateral, forged her signature to secure loans she would later be forced to repay. He held court in public restaurants, surrounded by women who laughed at his stories and men who raised eyebrows at his pretensions, and he carried himself not like a prince, but like someone pretending to have been one long enough that he believed it. And Victoria, still wearing the wedding ring, still serving tea in cups that once belonged to her mother, watched it all, sometimes with silent grief, sometimes with trembling hope, and sometimes, most heartbreakingly, with forgiveness. She sold her heirlooms, necklaces given by Queen Victoria, brooches once pinned to her mother's coronation gown, rings that had once rested on the hands of empresses, and paid off debts she had never agreed to incur. Her apartment grew emptier, her letters shorter, the smiles rarer. And yet she did not leave him. Even as his affairs grew more obvious, even as his gambling debts climbed, even as creditors knocked on her door and whispered apologies for requesting payment from a woman born to be above such things, she remained beside him. Perhaps because she could not bear another exile, or perhaps because she had gambled her final currency, her heart, and could not afford to fold the hand. By 1929, 2 years after the wedding, the fairy tale had frayed into something too painful to laugh at and too quiet to grieve publicly. Zubkov was arrested for fraud, accused of falsifying documents and forging signatures, hers among them, and was summarily expelled from Germany, packed off like a bad joke the nation no longer found amusing. He left without ceremony. No farewell, no kiss, just a void. And Victoria, once again, was alone. No crown, no family, no fortune, no love. Just the echo of a wedding march played too late, and a room filled with bills and silence. And still, she wore the ring. What began as a romance draped in scandal and stubborn hope soon deteriorated, not in sudden flames of betrayal, but in a slow, exhausting erosion of dignity, security, and self-worth. As if Victoria, already stripped of crown and kin, had offered up the last fragments of her inheritance not to fate or empire or duty this time, but to a man who smiled as he took, who kissed her hand as he emptied her accounts, who promised her tenderness while drawing her name through halls of laughter, too sharp to be kind. In the months after Alexander Zubkov's expulsion from Germany, Viktoria found herself not only alone in a cramped and fading apartment, but encircled by the consequences of his appetite. Bills piled like snowdrifts on her narrow writing desk. Debts she never consented to now stamped with her name. Creditors whose tone shifted from deferential to predatory once they realized the princess in front of them no longer had a royal court standing behind her. She answered the doors herself now. No footmen, no housemaids, no butlers to intercept the harsh knock of reality. Dressed still in velvet gloves and carefully maintained blouses whose lace had begun to fray at the collar, always composed, always speaking with the precise grammar of someone raised to believe that refinement might hold off collapse a little longer. But refinement doesn't pay interest, nor does a royal lineage settle rent. So she began to sell. At first, it was discreet. Quiet visits to antique dealers and jewelers who spoke in hushed tones, who understood without asking that these were not mere objects, but memory carved in gold. A tiara gifted by her mother on her 21st birthday. A brooch once worn by Queen Victoria herself. A set of silver combs engraved with the initials of her grandmother, Empress Augusta. Each piece carried out of her apartment wrapped in linen, never to return. Later, when the debts deepened, the sales grew more desperate. Furniture, paintings, silk gowns preserved for decades in cedar chests. Even the modest piano she had played as a girl beneath the chandeliers of Sanssouci. Each item leaving behind an emptier room, an echoing hallway, a silence that no music would fill again. She tried to keep one or two pieces, a portrait of her father, a ring with a single pearl, a handkerchief embroidered with her childhood nickname. But even those, in time, were offered to pawnbrokers when the heating bill arrived and the windows frosted over from within. The ring her husband had placed on her finger, the thin gold band that had once trembled beneath the flash of camera bulbs, was the last to go. She held it in her palm for nearly an hour before walking to the shop. She did not cry. She did not explain. She simply nodded when the man behind the counter gave her a price far too low and walked out into the cold air with a handful of coins and no wedding anymore. And yet the newspapers, ever hungry for spectacle, ever eager to gnaw on the bones of fallen royalty, did not forget her, not in sympathy, but in mockery. Daughter of emperors, reduced to poverty, they wrote, princess living in squalor, and most cruelly, the old woman who sold her throne for a kiss. Caricatures once again spread across Europe. Victoria depicted with a long nose and longer dress, begging on the street with a sign reading, "We'll marry for rent." Cartoonists portrayed Zubkov dancing in Paris while she scrubbed floors. They printed photos of her entering pawn shops. They described her face in harsh terms, wrinkled, haggard, pitiful. No one described the grace with which she still tied her scarf each morning. No one mentioned how she folded her linens with royal precision, or how she still stood when speaking to strangers, or how she kept a vase of dry flowers on the windowsill, not out of vanity, but because memory, too, needed tending. Her old friends had long since vanished. Those who once curtsied before her at court now crossed her name out from their guest lists. Some had died. Some had fled. Some simply didn't want to be reminded of how far they all had fallen. And Victoria, ever the dutiful daughter, the loyal sister, the silent woman in the background of dynastic dramas, said nothing. She didn't write memoirs. She didn't give interviews. She didn't publish letters accusing her husband or defending her honor. She lived instead in the residue of everything she had once been. A name without a place, a portrait without a frame, a ghost drifting through the remnants of an empire too embarrassed to remember her and too proud to grieve her. And yet, somehow, she endured. Each morning she brewed tea with a dented kettle and sipped from the last of her china cups. Each night she lit a candle beside her bed, not for prayer, but for warmth. She read the same books over and over: Goethe, Dickens, the Psalms. She spoke aloud to no one. She wore gloves even when alone, out of habit. She still had a pair of evening shoes, black satin, never worn again. And sometimes, when the world outside was particularly quiet, she would take out her wedding dress, folded and preserved in a linen chest, and lay it gently across her bed, not out of madness, but out of mourning. Not for the man who had left her, but for the version of herself who had believed, if only briefly, that she could be loved not for her lineage, but for her laughter. She would sit beside it, hands folded, back straight, staring at the bodice as if it might rise, reshape itself, whisper something to redeem the loss. But it never did, and neither did he. Zubkov wrote once, a postcard from Paris. No apology, no confession, only a signature. She didn't write back. She placed the card between pages of an old Bible and never opened it again. By late 1929, her body had grown thin, her hair silvered at the temples, her health quietly failing in the way sorrow sometimes manifests when no one is watching. She walked less. She slept more. She waited for what she could no longer name. And outside her window, the world that had once cheered her birth now passed her by without a glance. There comes a point in certain tragedies when the descent no longer feels like falling, but like floating downward through thick, muffled silence, where even shame begins to lose its sharpness, and the loneliness that once howled like a wounded animal now curls itself around the body like a second skin, heavy but familiar. And this was the kind of silence in which Princess Viktoria of Prussia lived the final months of her life. Not in scandal, not in noise, but in the unbearable stillness of being utterly, deliberately, and completely forgotten. After Zubkov was expelled from Germany in late 1929, with no trial, no fanfare, no consequence beyond a train ticket and a disappearing silhouette, Viktoria was left behind in a one-bedroom apartment in Bonn, furnished with a single armchair, a narrow bed with a worn lace canopy, 2 cracked teacups, and the ghosts of every room she had ever once called her own. There was no apology, no goodbye letter, no returned keys, just a vanished man, a dead marriage, and a woman too proud to ask where he had gone and too weary to pretend she didn't already know. The apartment, small even by bourgeois standards, had once been tolerable in its humility. A temporary refuge, she had told herself, a modest interlude between misfortunes. But now it became a kind of cell, a quiet prison where memory was the only furniture that grew heavier with time. She had no carriage, no companion, no visits from family. And though the rent was paid irregularly by selling the last remnants of her personal belongings, the landlord had begun to knock more frequently, with less patience, less deference, and a growing sense that he was no longer hosting a fallen aristocrat, but merely housing an old, penniless woman with a delusional name on the mailbox. The neighbors rarely spoke to her, or if they did, it was with the guarded curiosity one reserves for people rumored to have once been somebody. Children were told she had once been a princess, but they didn't know what that meant, and the grocers nearby simply referred to her as the English woman, though her German was flawless and her accent unmistakably Prussian. She cooked what little she could afford: thin broths, black bread, boiled potatoes when available, and often reused tea leaves multiple times, as if even bitterness could be stretched with enough grace. She kept her dignity in her habits, never leaving the apartment without gloves, never appearing in public with unkempt hair, always carrying herself with the posture of a woman trained to meet kings. even as her shoes wore thin and her hat lost its shape, and the coat she wore to market was nearly the same one she had worn to her brother's coronation decades earlier. And when passers-by looked at her, if they looked at all, they did not see a daughter of emperors, nor a sister of a Kaiser, nor the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. They saw only a tall, aging woman with hollow cheeks and trembling hands, who walked with care and looked at the world not with fear, but with the tired courtesy of someone who had long since stopped expecting it to answer back. Sometimes, late at night, she would speak aloud. Short phrases, fragments of conversations that had long since faded. Names whispered into the dark, her mother's voice echoing from childhood, the sound of court musicians tuning their instruments before a ball, the precise cadence of her father's laughter before illness stole it forever. She had no letters, no visitors, no Christmas cards, no invitations. Her name had vanished from society columns, was excluded from royal guest lists, was no longer attached to any foundation, any legacy, any memory that the proud Hohenzollern family wished to preserve in its increasingly selective mythology. She had, quite literally, been erased. Not executed, not imprisoned, not disgraced in any legal sense, but erased from history, from the narrative, from the conversations of cousins who now spoke only of crowns and continuity. Not of a woman who had once defied expectation and married for something as vulgar, as human, as love. Her belongings had dwindled to essentials: a chipped porcelain bowl she used for washing, a Bible with notes in the margins from her girlhood, a faded envelope with Zubkov's only letter, never opened again, and her wedding dress, folded with care in an old wooden chest, the fabric yellowing, the sleeves delicate, the veil still tucked inside like a pressed flower from a garden that no longer bloomed. And on the coldest nights, when the wind rattled the single-pane windows and the heater refused to come alive, she would remove that dress, not to wear it, not out of madness or nostalgia, but as a kind of ritual, a vigil for the version of herself that had once dared to hope, once dared to love, once dared to believe she might be more than a relic waiting to be archived by silence. She would lay it out across the bed, sit beside it, whisper nothing, and fold it back again before sunrise. Neighbors sometimes reported seeing her in the early morning light, standing at the window in her dressing gown, staring out over the roofs of Bonn as though waiting for something. An invitation, perhaps, or an apology, or just a sign that someone, somewhere, still remembered that she had once mattered. But no one came. No one knocked. No royal carriage arrived with an emissary. No letter with a seal. Not even a telegram. The once celebrated beauty of the Hohenzollerns, the princess painted by court artists and praised in European salons for her wit and grace, now lived on bread crusts and tap water, waiting for mail that never arrived, and reading the same psalms each morning as if they might eventually rewrite her story. She had no heirs, no fortune, no burial plot secured. Just a name she rarely spoke aloud anymore because it no longer opened doors, no longer earned courtesy, and no longer fit the life she now lived in full, suffocating obscurity. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, the detail that twists like a knife in the margins of her fading biography, is that she still believed, somewhere deep in the soft ruin of her heart, that he might come back, that Alexander might return, apologize, explain, carry her out of this, promise something warm again. But he never did. And so she remained, alone in a room too small for grief, too quiet for memory, and too indifferent for legacy. Princess Viktoria of Prussia, born under chandeliers, dying beside a flickering gas lamp, wearing gloves to wash her face, sleeping beside the dress she once wore to become someone's bride. On the morning of November 13th, 1929, as the gray skies of Bonn hung low and unmoving, and the wind outside failed even to rustle the brittle trees lining the narrow streets, Princess Viktoria of Prussia, once greeted with trumpet fanfare, once admired by artists and adored by nations, swallowed a small glass of poison in a silent room no larger than the dressing chamber she had once had in Potsdam, and lay down not upon a silk-sheeted deathbed, but upon a narrow cot, her head gently resting on the folded remnants of her wedding dress, the last soft thing she owned that had ever belonged only to her. There was no scream, no cry for help, no dramatic letter pinned to the wall with trembling hand, only a half-folded note in her delicate script, set beside an extinguished candle, with lines that bore no anger, no accusation, no final demand for justice. Only the exhausted truth of a woman who had outlived everyone who had once needed her, outlived the purpose she had been born for, outlived even the cruelty of the jokes whispered about her name. I have nothing left, but at least, for a moment, I was loved. There were no flowers, no priests summoned, no guards at the door. The postman knocked twice that day, once to deliver a bill, once to ask whether the rent for the month would be paid. And it was only after the neighbors noticed the light had not been switched on that evening, and the curtains remained closed despite the dark, that someone notified the building caretaker, who found her body fully dressed, her gloves still on, her lips faintly blue, the room unnaturally still, as though the very air had agreed to keep her final act a secret between the two of them. There was no scandal, no royal entourage rushing to reclaim the dignity of the fallen, no public statement from the exiled Hohenzollern family. In fact, the news of her death reached the newspapers not with urgency or sorrow, but with a kind of amused detachment, as if the final page of her life had been written in the margins of a satire. Eccentric Kaiser's sister found dead in rented apartment. Princess of Prussia dies alone, wore wedding dress to bed. Fallen royal's tragic end. Was it love, madness, or shame? The articles varied in tone, some sympathetic in a perfunctory way, others mockingly poetic. But all carried the same undertone, that Viktoria had been ridiculous in her end, as if her desire to be loved, to be remembered, to feel young again had been a form of treason not against the state, but against the decorum of growing old quietly. No newspaper printed the letter in full. No journalist noted how she had stopped eating the week before. No one described the last coat she wore, which was stitched from an old velvet curtain, carefully cut to fit. No obituary recalled the way she once laughed like sunlight catching crystal, or how she once danced for hours in the mirrored ballroom of Friedrichshof until the musicians fell asleep. She was remembered as a headline, not a woman. And even that remembrance was brief. The family, those cousins and nephews who still styled themselves as princes and duchesses in name, if not in consequence, refused to attend any funeral, refused to claim her body, refused to allow her death to stain the already fragile narrative of nobility in exile. The body was turned over to the local authorities, who, unsure how to handle royalty without a crown, arranged for a small, functional burial in a municipal cemetery on the edge of town, where the graves were numbered rather than named, and where the soil was too thin for flowers to grow without effort. There was no casket lined with velvet, no procession, no choir, only a priest paid by the hour and a gravedigger who didn't know who she was, until someone whispered that she had once been a princess, which made him dig a little slower, though not more carefully, because time was still time and the job still needed doing before dusk. A single woman from the neighborhood, who had once helped Victoria carry groceries, attended in silence, wearing her Sunday coat despite it being Wednesday. She left a bundle of dried lavender at the headstone. It was taken away the next morning. The dress, her wedding dress, was removed by the undertakers and discarded. Too stained, too faded, too strange. The note was kept briefly by the police and later lost. And so it was that the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the daughter of an emperor, the sister of a Kaiser, the once celebrated Rose of the Hohenzollerns, passed from life not with applause, not even with proper scorn, but with something colder than hatred, bureaucratic indifference. She had not been seen in public for months. Her name was no longer on anyone's lips. Her debts, unpaid, would be quietly written off as unrecoverable, and her memory would sink, inch by inch, into the soft soil of history, which too often forgets those who do not leave behind monuments, children, or victories. But what she did leave, though no one recognized it at the time, was a question that still lingers in the air around stories like hers. A question not shouted, but whispered beneath the veil of shame they wrapped around her name. What if she had never loved? Would we have forgiven her more easily? Because in the end, her crime was not theft or treason or scandal, but something more transgressive in a woman of her age, status, and gender. She had dared to believe that love, even when broken, even when foolish, even when devoured by betrayal, was still hers to choose. She had dared to marry not for alliance, but for hope. She had dared to defy time, and time, offended, erased her. In the years that followed her death, quiet years filled with louder wars and louder men, when the world once more burned under flags and boots, and the names of emperors were finally reduced to footnotes or curses, Victoria of Prussia was neither mourned nor defended, neither mythologized nor reviled, but simply not mentioned at all, as if the tragedy of her life was so inconvenient to the memory of royalty that even scandal was too generous a legacy, and forgetting her entirely became the most efficient method of erasure. She was not included in the retrospectives of imperial beauty, not placed in the family trees printed in monarchist journals, not cited in the memoirs of those who had once sipped champagne in her presence. Her face was absent from the galleries of royal portraits, her name omitted from footnotes, her story silenced beneath layers of embarrassment, as if loving too late and losing too completely had somehow made her unworthy of even historical curiosity. The Hohenzollerns, ever eager to reshape the wreckage of their dynasty into something more palatable for modern nostalgia, chose to remember the strong, the victorious, the tragic in noble terms. Empress Augusta, Emperor Frederick III, even Wilhelm II in his brooding Dutch exile. While Victoria, who had not led armies, birthed heirs, or upheld the family's desired image, was quietly brushed aside like a broken frame too fragile to repair and too inconvenient to display. She left behind no children to carry her name, no foundation to bear her vision, no palace that claimed her spirit in its halls. Just a handful of letters in private collections, some still unread, a few grainy photographs from before the fall of the empire, and a scattering of public records that reduced her existence to titles and dates, as if her years of breathing, yearning, grieving, and enduring could be adequately summarized by birth certificates and death announcements. But time, though cruel in its forgetting, can also be generous in its slow return. Decades passed. The 20th century twisted into itself, and somewhere between the collapse of monarchies and the rise of memory as resistance, a new kind of historian emerged, less concerned with crowns and more concerned with silence. Not the silence of diplomacy or policy, but the personal silences that once filled bedrooms, balconies, and broken lives like Victoria's. She became, not suddenly, but softly, a subject of footnotes again. First in obscure essays about the afterlives of royal women, then in academic studies on gender and grief within aristocracy, and finally in books that dared to question why so many women like her had been treated not as complex individuals, but as anecdotes used to reinforce a narrative that punished deviation and rewarded obedience to the myth of the noble female sufferer. In those pages, she began to reappear, not as the mad princess or the scandalous widow or the poor old fool, but as a woman caught between tectonic shifts of empire and gender, between the vanishing authority of bloodline and the rising demand that women disappear quietly once they were no longer useful. They traced her letters. They read her last note. They wondered aloud. What did it mean that she married someone 35 years her junior? Was it truly madness, or was it resistance? Was it desperation, or was it the first real choice of her entire life? And the deeper they looked, the more the shame shifted. Not away from Victoria, but toward the world that had crucified her, not for sin, but for audacity. Because the truth, now clearer in retrospect than it had ever been in her own lifetime, was that Victoria had not been humiliated by love. She had been humiliated by a society that could not stomach the idea of a woman, especially an aging woman, choosing love on her own terms after a lifetime of being chosen for things. Chosen for alliances, for lineage, for portraits, for appearances, but never, ever for herself. The real scandal, in the end, was not that she loved a man who betrayed her, but that she had dared to believe she had the right to do so without needing permission. And in that reframing, delicate, slow, incomplete, she began to matter again. Not to the family that disowned her, not to the courts that discredited her, but to those who saw in her story a quiet echo of all the other women who had been silenced because their desires were not deemed convenient or dignified or timely. She became, strangely, a symbol, not of folly, but of grief that refuses to behave, of love that arrives too late, of womanhood lived too long under the weight of titles that never protected her from pain. Scholars began to argue that her marriage, far from disgraceful, was one of the most human acts in the history of a family otherwise defined by posture and detachment. They spoke of her wedding dress, laid across her bed each night like a question no one had the courage to answer. They wrote about the photograph of her smiling beside Zubkov, not because the smile lasted, but because it had ever existed at all. And slowly, a different Victoria emerged. Not the caricature, not the headline, not the punchline whispered in imperial parlors, but a woman whose heartbreak exposed the rot beneath the marble of monarchy. That even those born with everything could die without anyone. That power does not protect from loneliness. And that sometimes the truest rebellion is not revolution, but tenderness. There is still no statue of her. No boulevard bears her name. But in the quiet corners of historical archives, in the essays passed between students of forgotten lives, she survives. Fragile, unfinished, but unmocked. Not a mad woman, not a martyr. Just a woman who lived long enough to be destroyed by both love and its absence. She did not die because she was weak. She did not die because she loved foolishly. She died because the world she was born into, ornate, scripted, hollow with expectation, had no space for a woman who chose love when she was supposed to choose silence, who reached for warmth after her usefulness had expired, who insisted, even in her last years, that she could be something other than a relic collecting dust in the back room of a dynasty that had long since closed its doors on her. Viktoria of Prussia, was not a tragic figure because she loved a younger man. She was a tragic figure because when she did, the world turned her love into a farce. Because we, as a species, still seem to believe that the desires of older women are somehow laughable, shameful, obscene. That after a certain age, affection is no longer a right, but a spectacle. That youth is allowed to seek connection, but age must settle for memories and folded hands. But Viktoria didn't settle. She refused to die waiting. And that is perhaps what sealed her fate, not her love, not her age, but her refusal to be quietly forgotten before her heart had finished speaking. Yes, he betrayed her. Yes, he took what little she had left. Yes, he vanished. But we must ask, who broke her more, Zubkov or the world that laughed when she reached for him? She was not a mad woman in a wedding dress. She was a woman who had outlived every role she had ever been allowed to play, and who, in her final act, tried to write something new, something tender, something hers. And the world responded not with compassion, but with mockery. If a woman born into palaces, crowned with legacy, fluent in 5 languages, painted by court artists, and praised in royal circles, could be cast aside, erased, and ridiculed simply for loving out of turn, then what hope do the rest of us have? That is the question Viktoria leaves behind, not as a plea for pity, but as a mirror we must dare to face. Because her story is not unique. Only the chandeliered ceilings and royal titles are rare. The heartbreak is universal. And the silence, the slow erasure of women who no longer fit the script, is far too common. So let us remember her, not as the sister of a Kaiser or the granddaughter of a queen, not as the punchline to a cruel joke whispered by people who never knew her, but as a woman who, despite everything, still believed love was worth the risk. She was mocked for believing. We should be mourning that we let her die alone for it. Thank you for watching. At Dark Ages Unveiled, we uncover the forgotten, the misunderstood, and the erased. Those whose lives were rewritten by history, or worse, never written at all. If Viktoria's story moved you, if you believe history should remember not just the powerful, but the broken and the brave, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to know her name. Because sometimes, the saddest tales aren't from the battlefield. They're from a quiet room, where a princess dies alone, still wearing her gloves.